AML Conversations. Today we have Bonnie Goldblatt, is the founder and CEO of AML Art Compliance Experts, but spent a career in this space, both in the private and public sector. So Bonnie, first, thank you so much for doing this. We want to talk a bit about what you're doing now, but also can you give us a sense of your career journey in law enforcement and the private sector as it applies to this area, which is a major area, but maybe not everybody in the AML community is as aware of it as you are.
Certainly, John. I want to thank you for having me on this show. So I have a unique perspective focusing on stolen and fraudulent art activity from a private and a public sector experience. I started with the U.S. Customs Service, and then it was with the successor agency, Homeland Security Investigations, where I was very fortunate to have a career that really focused on the interstate transactional activity of stolen and fraudulent art and antiquities. I started a art fraud program in the U.S. Customs Service, and then seeing the value and the need to have that as well in Homeland Security, I also then implemented that program where we were able to then seize international cultural property and art from all over the world. After I retired from the federal government, I was fortunate to join a very large financial institution where I oversaw an AML compliance investigative and intelligence program. So I had a totally different perspective of looking at the art market from within a financial institution.
So let's start with the basic premise. Why do criminals and other bad actors turn to the art industry? So give us a sense of that, and maybe a broad example or two of how they do that in terms of money laundering and fraud. We know there's counterfeiting that goes on, but give us a sense of all of that, and then we'll follow up with why it's so important that we do more, meaning the AML community does more than perhaps we're doing today.
Well, historically, the art industry's opacity is widely accepted. And let's begin there. So confidentiality is accepted. It protects the identity of the clients, the financial details of the sale, and they basically want to protect public disclosure of any sensitive motivations for buying or selling. These transactions are often high valued, and they're conducted in exclusive circles where private dealings are discreet. That's all acceptable. And there's historically been and continues to be a resistance for regulatory oversight. So compliance programs are all voluntary within this industry. So this is some of the appeal to why it's really may be utilized for illicit activity.
How does money laundering actually occur? I'll preface, I'll add to the question this interesting anecdote. We've done Right Source. We've done some programming in this space, and I had written, like you have done, a blog or a paper on the importance of having the art industry included under the BSA in some fashion. So folks from the art industry reached out to me specifically and said, we want to explain to you why we believe that we are covered in terms of voluntary standards and best practices. And I offered them a chance to do it in podcast form, and they turned me down. So talk also, not only how does money laundering happen, but your earlier point that best practices and guidance, great, but at the end of the day, there's no enforcement.
There's no enforcement. There's no consistency. It's vague. There's no legal backing. And the expectation that financial institutions' internal systems should detect the transactional activity that may be unusual is, I think, a stretch. Because when you think about the average analyst who works in a financial institution's AML compliance program, they're probably not very savvy on the nuances that the art industry holds: auction houses, dealers, brokers. So while you may have surveillance, the detection of unusual activity is going to be challenging. It's not unusual for a transaction where a wire may just say art, and it could be $1 million. That may not be unusual, and discretion is accepted. So this is a challenge that financial institutions definitely face.
Now, give us an example of sort of a basic money laundering transaction in the art industry. I do want to come back to your comment about the financial sector because I agree with you. It's not that they're not interested, but they can't be experts in 250 plus predicate offenses. I mean, it's not possible. There's wildlife trafficking, there's all sorts of things. So, but there are people like yourself that are in the private sector that are definitely interested. But I think part of it is outreach and explanation. So, give us a sense of a good example that you could describe in an elevator to somebody. This is how money laundering can occur with art.
Well, let's talk about sanctions evasion. Okay, something that's very current. So there may be some sanctioned individuals who want to move their wealth to other countries but can't because of the sanctions that have been imposed on them. So they'll use proxies, third parties, to purchase art from art brokers and dealers. Those people may be very legitimate, they're not sanctioned entities, and they'll purchase the art. Art, as we know, is very portable and can be moved cross borders. What you may see in the bank, though, is shortly after that purchase by that proxy of the art, another individual, a third party, it may be a corporation, then sends that individual a payment. And it may just simply say repayment of loan. Maybe once that's not suspicious, but when you see that over and over again, maybe that is. And then when you take, it's up to the bank and the financial institution to take a closer look at that third party. Is that third party potentially affiliated with a sanctioned individual? So that's why due diligence and the follow-up is very, very important.
That makes a ton of sense. So let's talk about you. We're at Homeland Security, and so we're involved in this area. I know that the FBI has an art theft group as well. What's happening in general with federal agencies and art related crime? So obviously there's counterfeiting, there's repatriation, that sort of thing from there's issues with museums and all that. But what are the agencies currently doing today, high level, that you're aware of?
Well, I know that when I left the Department of Homeland Security, we had launched an international program, and we were actually training agents and attaches in cooperation with the Smithsonian Institute and the Department of State, so they could. And also, there's a big push in training the customs inspectors, the front line, to identify cultural property and works of art that were being smuggled in. The Homeland Security has one of the biggest forfeiture laws that allows the forfeiture of art, and that was utilized quite often. Now, the National Stolen Property Act, the FBI utilizes often, and they have a very, very big art program as well, cultural property program. Now, more recently, and I know that I worked with them a lot when I was with the private sector, the IRS CID unit has been looking at NFTs, non-fungible tokens, because there's a belief that there's a lot of taxes that are not properly being paid on the profits when they're being sold. So you have a lot of players within the federal government involved.
Interesting. As I mentioned, we've both been involved to some degree with the policy push on antiquities and art. As we said, the art industry does not have requirements. There was a Treasury study which was mandated by the AMLO law from a couple of years ago that was completed a bit ago. And in that, I'm paraphrasing, of course, is they do mention that there are ways in which art is vulnerable to money laundering and financial crime, but they make a broader statement that at this point, it's not a priority for the Treasury Department. Not saying it's not an issue because FinCEN, as you know, has issued guidance on how to fill out a suspicious activity report when in dealing with art antiquities. What did Treasury miss by this? I mean, obviously they went. It was a lengthy report. It was well crafted. I don't have any qualms about how they did the research. But what are they missing? I know that there's so much on their plate, so that's something that they don't mention in the report, but that's certainly relevant. So I get that. But just looking at art as you've just described, what is it that if you were sitting at Treasury and making the call, you would have said regarding this, and why?
Well, I mean, and I want to say that it was a very comprehensive report, and I was actually interviewed on it.
Right.
And I just think that there's a lot of conflicting areas. There's a lot of competition there of where they're going to put their resources, and I think they're still looking at it. I think there's a reliance on the financial institutions who bank the industry for them to catch the unusual activity. And that's where I think there is a gap. I don't think that, it's very hard to train people on the nuances and what to look for in the art industry that may be unusual. And so I think that financial institutions really need to look at FinCEN has some great advisories. There are red flags there. They need to conduct specific training on the art and the art industry.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, as we said before, and you know this from your time in both the private and public sector. It's just impossible, given resources and all of the ways in which financial crime, illicit proceeds can be moved, that people in the AML space can be not even experts, but aware of all the ways in which these happen. So you're right. So let's talk a bit about that. You're in this career move that you've made now. You're going to be working with financial institutions and government agencies. I know you've done both in terms of training and awareness. Let's talk about the role of financial institutions. I come from that space. You come from that space. They do ask a lot of our community. There's no question about it. So what's realistic in terms of understanding this, and what would be a little bit, my words, not yours, over the top? Because again, you can't have everything. We've talked to folks in the human trafficking space, and there's obviously a lot of excellent AML professionals, but not everybody is aware of all those issues. This seems similar, probably harder to show why both it's important to know this and what to look for. So talk about the role of financial institutions.
Well, I think that knowing their customer is really, really important. And CDD, enhanced due diligence, is super important. I think that overwhelmingly, the art industry is reputable, right? But there are some unscrupulous actors, and they need to find their way into financial institutions. They need to be banked. So what they'll do is they'll try to place themselves in a line of business other than the obvious one where there will be the proper surveillance and oversight. And there's some areas that I've identified. I think with art brokers, they may qualify as a private wealth client, and private wealth clients open up PICs, private investment companies, which should probably not be used as an operational company, as an art dealership, where the oversight may not be as strong as if it was a commercial entity, where they may not have the same requirements, the due diligence, beneficial ownership, the same. So I think that it's very important for financial institutions to recognize what lines of business the art industry is banking in, so they have the proper oversight.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. One of the terms that I say you folks in art and antiquities use is provenance. Explain what that is and how that's relevant. Because I'm generally aware of it, but I'm sure a lot of people are like, wow, that's a $35 word. What does it mean?
I mean, provenance research is really important. And even when I was with the government, especially with the internet had just come out, hopefully I'm not aging myself, but all of a sudden, these hidden treasures in people's basements, they were found by grandchildren of maybe people who were in the war. And it started coming over the internet. And that's when they started researching some of these paintings. And it was just starting. And it became a really big thing. And so most galleries, auction houses, museums, they actually have a department of provenance research, the history of the painting. That's really important. We need to take that a step further. We need to know the history of the sourcing of the painting, of who owned it, whose hands it went through, right, at all times. Because you could have a perfectly good, legitimate painting that was indeed made by the artist. However, at some point, was it bought with proceeds of drug sales? What sanctions individual have it? So I think that we really need to look at who the seller or the buyer is and do that research of the individual, just as opposed to the painting or the work of art itself.
How much of the misuse of art from illicit purposes is benefiting oligarchs? Because it would seem to me people with excessive amounts of money, that's obviously a clear way to move your proceeds. But And you've talked about sanctions evasion, but just in general, would you characterize a large percentage in this space, are what we would call oligarchs or politically exposed persons, that sort of thing?
Yes, it is. And it's just, when you close the doors to all of these other industries that have high valued items, what do you have left? And here we have an industry that can fetch what the latest Magritte was over $100 million this year at Christie's. I mean, you have this. What a better way than to use this to move your wealth into a country that you otherwise would be sanctioned in?
You mentioned, and I think it's related to your provenance research, something that you've called proactive data mining. When you're doing some of your training, but whether for the government or the private sector, what are some sources for that data mining? What are some recommendations that you have?
Well, I think in the area of sanctions, when an individual or entity is sanctioned, I think you need to look at who they transacted with prior to the sanctions. Then look at those individuals and companies after the sanctions and see if there's a new player now that's transacting with that individual, that auction house. Potentially, that could be maybe a proxy for that sanctioned individual. You can do that. You can also look at the cycles. Auction houses generally have cycles of sales, right? If you compare the different cycles, it shouldn't be just one continuous sale amount of sales, right? It should be cyclical. So you can also look at the patterns of sales to see if or is this auction house just really moving money from one jurisdiction to another? Because don't forget, financial institutions do not have any visibility into the actual movement of the item.
Right. This issue is global, obviously. Give us some sense of what other jurisdictions are doing. Again, I know, like I said, there are, and you know this, that there are best practices, and I know there's a industry. I think the acronym is RAM. I might be misremembering that, but talk a bit about the international scope of this issue, and then where are most of the jurisdictional challenges? Obviously, here we don't have laws and regs, but we have a little more awareness than we did, say, 10 years ago. So, if you're providing advice to multinational institutions that obviously that you've worked with and been at, what are some of the jurisdictional issues outside of the U.S. and how global is it? Again, not asking you for statistics, but just in general, based on your experience.
Well, when you're looking at corporate structures, right, and especially in the purchase or the sale of art, I think you should look to see a corporate structure that's incorporated in one country, but it's banking in another country. That's often raises a red flag in its area of concern. Countries that are traditionally protective of their cultural heritage are definitely very cooperative and always have been. In the area of art and antiquities, it's just not consistent across the board, and so that's what makes it difficult. There are institutions. Interpol is very helpful with law enforcement cross border, and they sort of bridge that gap, especially when law enforcement's involved. But with financial institutions, it still remains a challenge when there's not any regulatory compliance requirements across the board.
Yeah, I know that FATF has talked about this and other organizations. I would imagine that, the U.S. is a prime area, just given the location of auction houses and all those sorts of things. You've worked on cases both in the government and in the private sector, and probably can't talk too specifically, but talk some in your career, some of the successes that you've been part of in terms of getting artifacts and art back to where they belong. Just how the role of being in law enforcement enabled that to occur, and then how being in the private sector. So again, you don't have to give us the specifics, but just in general, because I know you've worked on a lot of that, and I think that's both a tribute to your passion and focus, but also the value proposition of understanding how all this works.
Well, I think what was interesting, and probably few people know this, but a lot of European countries have specific investigative law enforcement units that's just dedicated to the repatriation of cultural property and art. And I believe that it was Interpol and a lot of some other organizations who used to bring us together. And so there is a close knit community of people who have that passion. And so we can really work together very well cross border. And that was always very helpful. Additionally, when you're working in a financial institution, um, there are, financial institutions also cooperate with ACAD. You know that there's the 314B, and we also do attend meetings and conferences with law enforcement that really can help bridge the gap.
The what I remember, and I might have met you at that meeting. It was a meeting probably 8, 9 years ago in DC, and there the prime speaker was an Italian police chief who had his own group that they actually worked on going after art related issues, not just in Italy, but around Western Europe. And I was fascinated with that. And we actually had that same, I forget the rank, but we had that same individual speak at a forum that we put on in DC just last year. But I was always fascinated. It always struck me as that this group was doing this work not just for their own jurisdiction but for others. But that was a perfect example of what you just described.
Was that the Carabinieri?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
that was
so
it. Yes.
we used to work with them all the time, and I recall one of the officers was walking down Madison Avenue while he was on vacation here in New York when I was an agent, and he gave me a call and he took a picture. He saw a statue in Madison Avenue Gallery, and he said, "This was stolen." I said, "Give me the proof." He gave me all the proof, and we walked in. We were able to seize it and then repatriate it to Italy. Yeah, those are a great group of women and men.
Yes, that's an amazing example. Only happened in New York, right? Um, the I'll get you I'll get you out of here on this. The Antiquities Coalition is working on a piece, an op-ed piece that they're going to pitch to a few publications in the next couple of weeks. But some of these auction houses actually provide loans. They actually do lending. And obviously, maybe not obviously others, but to you and I, they're not under the same financial institution your infrastructure as banks are. So I think that would be another way in which that could be problematic, no, in terms of no oversight there. I don't know enough about that area, but I know the antiquities folks feel that that's another clear example of why art should broadly be placed under the Bank Secrecy Act.
Right. I mean, and you would think that they would do the proper amount of due diligence to secure that loan. So that is definitely a cottage industry that has been sprouting up. It's a big business using art as collateral, and one would think that proper due diligence is done so they can protect their investment.
So, Bonnie, you've created this AML Art Compliance Experts. Tell us a little bit about what people can expect. I would remind folks we will post the link to the website. The website is AACE-AML.com. And you've just started this recently. Tell us a little bit about what you hope to accomplish with this group.
Sure. Well, I wanted to blend my public and private experience in the art industry to actually protect this industry. I think, there's nothing more important to galleries and auction houses than their reputation. And unfortunately, there are some unscrupulous people in the industry. There are money launderers who want to utilize the industry. And I think that there could be a right size compliance program that can be implemented. I know it's not required, but just it's in the best interest. And just implementing some controls may really be able to, in the long run, protect a company and protect their interests.
Bonnie Goldblatt, thank you so much for spending time and sharing your insights today. Super appreciate it. We hope to have you on again. I know this issue is going to continue to challenge all of us, and I think I know you and I have worked with people within our industry that get passionate about issues like this and want to do more. So you're certainly going to help them sort of navigate that area. So thank you so much for spending time today. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, John.